March 12, 1943. Berlin was a city wrapped in tension, its streets dim beneath the weight of war. The sound of jackboots echoed against cobblestones, mingling with the distant hum of trams and the faint wail of sirens. In a small cafe near Friedrichstrasse, smoke drifted in heavy curtains, mingling with the bitter aroma of weak coffee. The chatter was subdued, every voice careful, every glance measured. At one corner table, a young woman sat alone, her posture neat, her eyes lowered as though lost in thought. To the casual observer, she was merely a secretary taking a quiet break from office drudgery. Beneath her calm exterior, her heart pounded. With one careful movement, she slid a folded note beneath her porcelain cup. Inside lay carefully copied troop schedules, divisions scheduled for transport to the Eastern Front. To her, it was more than paper. It was a weapon, as deadly as any rifle. Outside, the Gestapo prowled the boulevards, men in dark coats scanning the faces of citizens as though the slightest flicker of unease betrayed guilt. The cafe door creaked open, and a gust of cold air swept inside. She looked up briefly, masking her fear as a soldier stepped in. His uniform carried the dust of recent marches. He ordered a drink, his eyes drifting across the room. For a fleeting moment, she feared he would notice her trembling hands, the faint sheen of sweat on her brow. Instead, his gaze passed over her, settling on a newspaper stand. She rose, leaving coins on the table, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor. The note remained hidden beneath the cup. Moments later, another patron, an unassuming man with a worn overcoat, would collect it. To the world, it was an ordinary exchange. To the Allies, it was intelligence worth lives. In these quiet, smoky corners of Berlin, women fought their war in silence. Unlike the soldiers at Stalingrad or the pilots in the skies over London, their battlefield was the whisper, the glance, the folded scrap of paper. They risked everything not with bullets, but with lies disguised as truth. Berlin itself was a paradox. It was the heart of the Reich, draped in banners and loud with proclamations of loyalty to Hitler, yet beneath the surface it harbored a shadow war. The Special Operations Executive in Britain, the French resistance, and Soviet NKVD agents all maintained fragile webs of spies across Germany. Women played decisive roles in these networks. Secretaries in government offices copied documents after hours. Typists in Wehrmacht headquarters smuggled troop rosters. Even nurses in military hospitals relayed rumors of wounded officers and shifting divisions. One diary, preserved decades later, recorded the strain of living two lives at once. By day I salute the eagle. By night I curse it. Every word I write could be my last. It was not romantic bravado, but bitter truth. The Gestapo's prisons filled with those caught whispering too loudly, or trusted by the wrong friend. Still, the networks grew. Some women had been trained in Britain, learning how to work radios, forge documents, or resist interrogation. Others were drawn in by the resistance in occupied France or Belgium and later tasked with assignments inside Germany. But many simply fell into espionage because the war gave them no choice. Their positions in offices, cafes, or train stations gave them access that men in uniform could never enjoy. The risk was constant, suffocating. Berlin in 1943 was a city of watchers and informants. A misplaced word, a glance exchanged in the wrong place, could end with a knock at midnight. Interrogators thrived on suspicion. The Gestapo understood the power of fear, and their shadow loomed larger than any army. Yet even in this atmosphere, women carried scraps of intelligence, dates, names, rail schedules, across the city, feeding a war machine they opposed from within. That evening in the cafe, the note passed unseen, but the danger lingered in every heartbeat. Outside, columns of German troops prepared for their eastbound trains. They marched with the certainty of soldiers carrying out orders. None knew that a simple folded paper, moved from hand to hand, would reach London in days and alter how the Allies calculated the Reich's dwindling strength. The woman disappeared into the night, her figure swallowed by the blackout streets of Berlin. She carried nothing but the memory of her small defiance. Tomorrow, she would return to her desk, typing reports, smiling politely at officers, and hiding her fear. To the world, she remained invisible. To history, she and women like her became the silent blades aimed at the Reich's heart. Their war began not with bombs, but with whispers, not with glory, but with shadows. And for every soldier marching eastward, there was a woman somewhere in Berlin, risking everything so that the Allies might know what the Reich wanted to keep hidden. In the world of Nazi-occupied Europe, women were seldom viewed as threats. The Reich celebrated them as mothers, nurses, and secretaries, roles that kept them close to home and out of the spotlight. But this very assumption became their most effective disguise. While uniformed men were scrutinized, searched, and stopped at checkpoints, women carried baskets of bread, typed reports in government offices, and rode trains without suspicion. The Gestapo underestimated them, and the Allies recognized the opportunity. By 1941, the British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, began recruiting women for missions inside occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Later, the American OSS followed suit, understanding that the invisibility of women could outmaneuver the Reich's paranoia. Recruits came from all walks of life: aristocrats fluent in languages, refugees who had fled the Nazi terror, students, factory workers, even nurses who volunteered after seeing too many of their patients marched to camps. Training transformed them from civilians into operatives. In secluded English estates, recruits learned Morse code by lantern light, memorizing sequences of dots and dashes until their fingers ached. They practiced parachute jumps in the chill of the countryside, rehearsed sabotage drills against mock railway lines, and forged identity papers that had to withstand the scrutiny of Gestapo officers trained to detect the smallest error. Manuals warned them of torture and instructed how to endure interrogation, though no training could truly prepare them for the reality of capture. What set them apart was not brute strength or superior firepower, but subtlety. They knew how to blend into the crowd, how to smile politely at a soldier while concealing coded notes in the hem of a skirt, how to deliver messages under the cover of ordinary errands. In a war where information could mean victory or catastrophe, their unassuming presence became one of the Allies' sharpest weapons. One SOE instructor later remarked, "A woman with a basket of apples could carry more secrets through a checkpoint than a man with a pistol." This was the paradox that defined their role. Their power came from being dismissed as powerless. Across Europe, their networks spread quietly. A French typist in a German administrative office passed copies of troop orders to resistance couriers. A Belgian nurse tended wounded officers while overhearing plans of troop withdrawals. In Berlin itself, secretaries carried intelligence out of government buildings in the folds of their coats. Each acted under constant threat of exposure, their courage magnified by the ordinariness of their disguise. Diaries captured the psychological burden of transformation. One recruit wrote, "I must laugh when they laugh, salute when they salute, nod when they nod. Every gesture must belong to them, though every thought belongs to London." Another recorded her first mission. Leaving a satchel of explosives on a railway bridge, her hands trembling as trains thundered in the distance. To passers-by, she was only a woman waiting for her husband. To history, she was dismantling the Reich's war machine. The Nazi state prided itself on discipline and surveillance, yet its own ideology blinded it. By reducing women to auxiliaries and homemakers, it created a blind spot, one the Allies exploited with precision. Female operatives could move in ways men could not, their workspaces in offices, kitchens, and wards offering unparalleled access to secrets the Reich believed safe. But invisibility came at a cost. Success meant anonymity. Failure meant the noose or the camp. Many were betrayed by informants, their cover shattered in a single careless moment. Gestapo records from 1943 describe captured women spies with disbelief, as though the very idea offended the logic of Nazi control. Yet the damage had already been done. By the time their names appeared in interrogation files, their intelligence had often already crossed the channel, changing Allied strategy in subtle but vital ways. This chapter of the Shadow War was not waged with rifles or tanks, but with silence, patience, and an ability to be overlooked. Ordinary women, students, nurses, secretaries, stepped into a role the world had never expected of them. Invisible recruits in a conflict where the smallest scrap of paper could tip the balance of battle. Their transformation was complete. What began as clerical duty or resistance out of grief became espionage. They were no longer invisible to history, though in their time they vanished into the background. Their war, fought in the margins, would soon converge with the broader currents of Europe's destruction and survival. By the winter of 1943, the war in occupied Europe had become a war of silence and shadows. Female operatives, once dismissed as secretaries or nurses, were now the lifeblood of Allied intelligence networks. Their bicycles rattled along dusty French roads, baskets heavy not with bread or milk, but with forged papers, coded messages, and sometimes explosives disguised beneath vegetables. Each pedal stroke carried risk. Each glance from a German soldier could mean exposure. In barns, attics, and cellars, radios crackled to life. Women hunched over sets that weighed nearly 15 kilograms, tapping messages in Morse code with trembling fingers. Every transmission was a race against time. German direction-finding vans prowled the streets, triangulating signals. 3 minutes too long, and the Gestapo could pinpoint the location. Windows would shatter before dawn, and the operator would vanish into a prison cell, her fate sealed. Still, without these broadcasts, Allied command would have been blind. The messages carried were simple, yet decisive. Train movements from the Ruhr, fuel convoys heading west, or the position of coastal defenses that would one day face the D-Day invasion. A single transmission could reroute a bombing run or halt a German advance. One courier later recalled, "I carried a note no bigger than a matchbox. Inside, it was the destruction of an entire supply line." Couriers wove the fragile web that kept resistance alive. They carried sabotage instructions stitched into coat linings or inked in invisible letters on children's drawings. In Paris, a typist delivered coded lists of collaborators hidden in the bindings of novels. In Belgium, a nurse slipped railway schedules between layers of gauze in her medical bag. The genius of their work lay not in grand gestures, but in the quiet concealment of secrets in plain sight. Fear was constant. Betrayal came not always from soldiers, but from neighbors, informants who traded names for rations or favors. A knock at midnight could unravel an entire network. Diaries speak of the unbearable tension, the long walks past checkpoints where a single lingering stare could make the heart seize. One operative wrote, "I smiled at him, though I could not feel my lips. His eyes searched my basket. He lifted an apple, and beneath it was death." She survived that day, but many others did not. And yet, for every courier lost, another stepped forward. Their work connected scattered cells of resistance across Europe. A bicycle ride across the Loire might link a saboteur to an arms drop. A whispered phrase exchanged at a market might confirm an Allied contact. These tiny threads wove a vast web, stretching from village barns to London headquarters. Without them, Allied operations like D-Day would have unfolded in darkness. The irony was stark. The Reich prided itself on surveillance and control, yet its paranoia blinded it. Women carrying baskets, tending wounds, or filing papers were invisible to the machine of occupation. Their invisibility became a weapon sharper than any blade. But invisibility did not lessen the danger. Many were caught. Radios betrayed by static, codes uncovered, or informants who cracked under pressure. Interrogation rooms in Gestapo headquarters heard the last words of countless women who had carried secrets across borders. Their silence under torture saved thousands, even as it cost them everything. For those who survived, the weight of the web remained heavy. Every journey, every coded letter, carried the lives of others. The knowledge that one slip, a misplaced word, a look of fear, could unravel months of work haunted them. Yet they persisted. Through these fragile, perilous networks, the women of the Shadow War rewrote the balance of intelligence. Their radios hummed across the night. Their bicycles cut through occupied streets. Their whispers passed between cellar walls. They had built a web of deception so intricate, so resilient, that even under the gaze of the Reich, it endured. The Shadow War was as fragile as it was vital, and betrayal often struck from the places least expected. A neighbor who watched too closely, a forged document smudged with ink, a radio operator who tapped for 2 minutes too long. Each mistake left a thread dangling, ready for the Gestapo to pull. For many women in espionage, that pull ended in capture. The Gestapo's prisons were not places of quick justice, but slow unraveling. Women were locked in cells where light rarely entered, their bodies worn down by beatings and starvation. Silence was their final shield. Every blow carried the demand for names, codes, and safe houses. Yet many refused to yield. Among the most famous was Noor Inayat Khan, the British Indian wireless operator parachuted into France in 1943. Her set was compromised, her movements traced. Captured in Paris, she was interrogated for months. Though beaten, chained, and threatened with execution, she revealed nothing. Prisoners later recalled hearing her voice rise defiantly in the corridors, refusing to betray her network. To the Gestapo, she was a liability. To the Allies, she became a legend. Others were less well known, their courage recorded only in fragmentary testimonies. In Ravensbrück, the notorious women's concentration camp, captured couriers and nurses were reduced to skeletons, but clung to silence. Some whispered prayers through cracked lips. Others stared blankly at interrogators, choosing death over betrayal. One diary recovered decades later described the moment a young woman handed over her shoes to another prisoner, saying only, "You must live. My part is done." The methods of torment were precise and cruel. Prisoners were denied sleep for days, left standing until their legs gave out, subjected to icy dousing in winter cells. Letters to families were withheld, replaced by forged notes designed to break morale. Even food became a weapon, doled out in scraps to coax information. Yet, time and again, the Gestapo underestimated the resolve of those they deemed fragile. Women who had been typists and students proved unbreakable against the machinery of fear. Some networks were destroyed, their members rounded up and executed. In Lyon, the betrayal of a single operator led to mass arrests, entire circuits of resistance wiped out. Yet even in failure, their silence preserved fragments of the greater web. Each woman who held her ground denied the Reich information that could have unraveled Allied preparations for D-Day or crippled sabotage efforts in occupied Europe. Survival in these prisons was rare, but survival itself was not the only measure of victory. For many, loyalty became the battlefield. To endure beatings without speaking, to face the firing squad with eyes unflinching. These were acts of defiance as decisive as sabotage. And yet, the cost was unbearable. Families never saw their daughters return. Resistance networks mourned operators who had once carried radios across fields or cycled through checkpoints with forged papers. Graves remained unmarked, their stories buried in silence until decades later. when archives and survivor testimonies revealed fragments of their courage. The Gestapo believed it could break the human spirit with chains and torture. What it often encountered instead was an immovable wall of conviction. These women did not see themselves as heroes. Many wrote in diaries or whispered to comrades that they were simply doing what was required. But history remembers them differently. They became symbols of unyielding defiance in a war where silence could be more powerful than speech. Every forged document, every coded message carried a price, sometimes paid in blood. For those who fell into enemy hands, resistance did not end at capture. It continued in the decision to protect others, even as their own lives were extinguished. War is often remembered for its tanks, artillery, and infantry charges, but in the shadows, the quiet work of espionage altered the battlefield long before the first shot was fired. By 1944, female operatives had become a vital thread in the Allied web of deception. Their messages, carried across occupied Europe and transmitted through clandestine radios, reshaped the timing and geography of the conflict. In the months leading to June 6, 1944, intelligence from these women sowed confusion in German high command. Some delivered false reports that reinforced Hitler's belief in a landing at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Their whispers convinced the Wehrmacht to hold panzer divisions in reserve hundreds of miles from the true invasion site. When Allied troops stormed the beaches, those divisions were still waiting for a battle that never came. Other women provided far more direct support. A courier in Brittany relayed details of supply shortages plaguing German coastal defenses. In Paris, radio operators transmitted sketches of fortifications, bunkers, and troop rotations, allowing Allied bombers to strike with uncanny precision. In Belgium and northern France, female couriers mapped train schedules, guiding sabotage teams to derail troop transports. Each act bought hours, sometimes days, for advancing armies. The risks were immense. A wrong turn at a checkpoint could doom an entire network. Yet the flow of intelligence never ceased. Testimonies recall women riding bicycles through countryside, lanes with packets of coded messages hidden in bread loaves or tucked into hems of skirts. In barns and attics, they tapped out signals in Morse code, knowing every second increased the chance of German direction-finding vans locking onto their frequency. One operator later wrote, "Each word I sent felt like a heartbeat. Too slow, and we died. Too fast, and they found us." On the ground, their sabotage amplified the chaos. Resistance cells, often coordinated by female couriers, cut telephone wires, sabotaged locomotives, and blew bridges in the hours before D-Day. In Normandy, these actions delayed German reinforcements long enough for Allied footholds to become unshakable. The collapse of transport lines across occupied France was not the work of armies, but of invisible hands working by lantern light and under curfew. The consequences reverberated beyond the beaches. Intelligence funneled by women across Europe guided Allied advances toward Paris and beyond. In Warsaw, coded reports helped the Soviets prepare their offensives. By late 1944, the Reich's military machine was staggering not only from the weight of Allied firepower, but also from the steady erosion of its own secrecy. For German commanders, the frustration was palpable. Orders issued at dawn were already in Allied hands by dusk. Troop movements, once secure, were anticipated and ambushed. A general reportedly exclaimed that there must be a ghost in every office, a spy in every room. In truth, many of those ghosts were women dismissed as secretaries, nurses, or simple housewives. Their invisibility had become their strength. Yet the women themselves rarely saw their work in grand terms. To them it was survival, duty, or loyalty to families torn apart by war. One diary entry captured the paradox. "I cannot fire a rifle. I cannot stop the bombers. But perhaps, with this one paper, I can help." History would not remember them in parades or medals. Their victories came in silence, in the panzer divisions that never reached Normandy, in the trains that never carried troops to reinforce Berlin, in the fortifications bombed before they could be manned. From attics and cellars, they turned the tide of the war, one coded signal at a time. Their battlefield was invisible, but its consequences were written across Europe's liberation. The guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945, but for the women who had fought their own invisible war, the end brought no triumphal marches. They returned not to parades, but to shadows. While generals and statesmen inscribed their names into the chronicles of victory, female spies and couriers slipped quietly back into obscurity. Some carried the scars of captivity, their bodies marked by the Gestapo's interrogations, their minds haunted by memories too heavy to speak aloud. Many never told their families what they had endured. Children grew up unaware that their mothers had once faced down torture chambers or typed coded messages that changed the course of battles. Silence became their armor in a society eager to move forward. Others broke their silence decades later, their words arriving as whispers from the past. Memoirs, often published late in life, revealed the hidden chapters of wartime resistance. A nurse-turned-courier recounted how she smuggled microfilm across checkpoints in the folds of her apron. A wireless operator described the relentless dread of hearing boots on the stairwell while she tapped out signals in Morse code. These testimonies, raw and unadorned, offered glimpses into the courage long overlooked. Recognition, however, remained elusive. In both East and West Germany, women who had spied were rarely honored. In the West, some were branded as reckless adventurers or even traitors for collaborating with foreign intelligence services. In the East, their sacrifices were often subsumed under the larger narrative of Soviet liberation. Few medals were awarded, fewer statues raised. Their legacy was scattered, faded photographs tucked into drawers, coded diaries hidden in attics, occasional medals given quietly, without ceremony. The paradox of their silence ran deep. These women had helped to fracture the machinery of the Reich, yet in post-war Europe, their presence unsettled. They were reminders of a war that society longed to forget, and of methods, lies, sabotage, subversion, that clashed with the neat narratives of noble sacrifice. Some were even viewed with suspicion, their wartime loyalties questioned in the paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War. Yet history carried their fingerprints. The troop movements delayed in Normandy, the trains sabotaged in France. The reports that reached Allied commanders in time to change battle plans all bore the imprint of female operatives whose names never appeared in the official records. Their war was written not in medals, but in margins, diary fragments, coded notes, and the faint scratches of radio signals pulsing through the ether. In living rooms and kitchens, fragments of their stories slipped out in moments of intimacy. A daughter once asked her mother why she startled at the sound of a knock in the night. The answer came only years later. Because once, I waited for them to take me away. For many, survival itself had been an act of defiance, but in peacetime, that defiance dissolved into quiet resilience. By the 1960s and 1970s, as historians began to unearth overlooked narratives of resistance, some of these women were finally acknowledged. A few received late honors from Britain or France, their names spoken in ceremonies far from the streets where they had risked their lives. Yet for every woman recognized, many more remained anonymous, their contributions buried beneath layers of silence and stigma. Their absence from parades and textbooks does not erase their impact. Instead, it reveals the uncomfortable truth. Wars are not only won by the men in uniform, but also by those who worked in shadows, unseen and unheard. The aftermath of their struggle was not glory, but invisibility. And yet, through silence, memory, and fragments of testimony, their story endures. The war ended not with fireworks for them, but with silence. In the spring of 1945, as Germany collapsed and Allied flags rose over liberated cities, a thin young woman emerged through the iron gates of a Gestapo prison. Her hair was cropped short, her uniform replaced with rags, her face hollowed by hunger. Yet in her eyes flickered something unbroken. She had carried secrets through interrogation, endured nights of terror, and resisted when surrender would have meant relief. She was one of many, women whose invisible war had left no medals on their chest, but whose whispers had shifted the tides of history. They had tricked the Reich not only with forged papers, secret radios, and coded notes, but with the endurance of ordinary human will. In Berlin, cafes; in Paris, attics; on bicycles racing down country lanes, they had played their part. Their war was not marked by sweeping front lines, but by fragments: a folded map, a single name withheld, a radio signal pulsing through static in the night. Their legacy endured not in monuments, but in the freedoms secured by their silence. Europe's liberation was written in part by the hands of women who could never admit what they had done. In Paris, one wireless operator, after years of hiding her work beneath floorboards and curtains, switched off her set for the last time as Allied troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. Her mission was over. Her story, like so many others, was already fading into the shadows. The paradox remained haunting. These women, dismissed by regimes as weak, had proved among the most cunning fighters of the war. They navigated checkpoints with calm lies, carried intelligence across borders hidden in clothing seams, and endured torture with silence that defied an empire. They reshaped the battlefield without ever firing a gun. History, however, often overlooked them. While generals and statesmen filled textbooks, these women lived quietly in the aftermath. Teachers, mothers, secretaries, nurses once more. Some revealed fragments of their past only decades later, when age loosened the grip of secrecy. Others carried it to their graves, their courage buried with them. But their impact lingers, like an echo. Every bridge delayed from sabotage, every troop division diverted by false intelligence, every life saved by the knowledge they carried. These were victories born in the silence of their invisible war. Their resistance was not a spectacle, but a whisper, and yet those whispers carried farther than the shouts of tyrants. The final image is indelible. A young woman in 1945, gaunt yet unbowed, standing in the rubble of a ruined city. Around her, the symbols of a fallen Reich crumbled into dust. She clutched no weapon, wore no medal, yet bore within her the quiet triumph of survival, of endurance, of having defied the machine built to crush her. Their stories remind us that war is not only fought on battlefields of steel, but also in the shadows where truth and deception collide. And in those shadows, women, underestimated, invisible, forgotten, changed the fate of Europe.